Howdy howdy, my name is John, and this video is a spoiler-free review of Bio of a Space Tyrant, Volume 1, Refugee, by Piers Anthony. This is one of the series of Piers Anthony's that I have not previously read, and I was really looking forward to reading this series. This first book, however, really disappointed me. If you have not read Piers Anthony before, I do not recommend starting with this book. This book has a lot of problems with it. The biggest problem I had with it is the characters in this book make a lot of kind of unbelievable decisions. One of the things that I really don't like to see in a book is when a character makes a decision, and I have trouble believing that any character would have made that decision. Now, I'm okay with characters making bad decisions because, bad decisions are just part of life. I can also certainly forgive one or two instances of a character making an unbelievable decision, but unfortunately to me, this book was just full of them. Another problem I have with this novel is the fact that it's written in first person. Now, first person does make sense in the context of the story, but first person is not something I see Anthony typically writing in. In fact, I think, if I can remember correctly, this is the only novel of his that I've read that's in first person. With Anthony being unfamiliar with first person, that made for some awkward writing as well. One thing about when a person is actually telling you a story, especially a story of their own life, is that that person will typically kind of get off track and, tell some stories that are kind of not relevant to the main story. Unfortunately, Anthony tries to mimic that in the novel. Now, you can get away with it if you're actually orally telling a story to someone, but for this novel, it really made for some awkward writing. Another issue I had with this novel is Anthony actually, in places, tries to make this a hard science fiction story. Now, I did find one or two of the concepts interesting, especially the concept of a gravity lens. But because Anthony kind of stops the story to explain why the kind of science is happening, it makes for awkward reading. It really breaks up the pace of the novel. And this story really does not need kind of the scientific explanations of the story. This, at its heart, is a soft science fiction story. Yes, space is the place where all of this action happens, and some explanation is okay, but really the focus of this needs to be on the characters and the action. The last negative that I'm going to talk about is at one point in the novel, Anthony makes a very clear, very obvious social commentary on kind of real world events. Now, this was written in the early 80s, but still it's an issue that we're dealing with today. Because Anthony made this very obvious social commentary and didn't do it well, it forces the novel to go in a direction that, had it gone in a different direction, the story would have been much better. The next thing I want to talk about isn't really a positive or a negative. It's really going to depend on the individual reader. This book has a lot of violence in it, and some of that violence is toward children. That makes this book, at least for me, very uncomfortable to read. At least I appreciated the fact that most of the violence actually takes place off screen. He doesn't go into graphic detail about the violence that happens. So, here again, if you really want to see the violence, it's not there, but it's described enough that, again, for me, it made for some uncomfortable reading. With that said, I do think the violence is necessary for the story. The truth of the matter is this stuff happens in the real world every day, and it's not something we should turn a blind eye toward. That brings me to the one bright spot of this novel, and it actually deals with how to handle the trauma from being a victim of this kind of violence. Now, do all of the characters necessarily make the best decision? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that. But it's an interesting exploration of the topic. In conclusion, this is actually probably the worst written novel that I've ever read of Piers Anthony. Now, there are a few that I read way in the past, so it's a little hard to make that call, but it's not my lowest rated of his works, but it is one of the lowest rated. And it made coming up with a rating really hard for this. There's some parts of this novel that are kind of 4 or 5 star for me. The writing in this is a 2 star for me. So I wound up kind of balancing that out and coming up with a 3 star rating. I actually almost gave this 4 stars, but the ending really kind of let me down, and there's too much wrong with this novel to give it a 4 star rating. And really, I can completely understand a 1 or a 2 star rating on this. I am planning on continuing in the series, and I'll probably do a series review once I've read the remaining 5 books. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.